And next up is from Manatee County, Damon Moore.
Okay, so this is the first time I've given this presentation anywhere that wasn't real close to home base where everybody didn't already know what I was talking about. So I'm in Manatee County, which is out there, take a right, 130 miles. Robinson Preserve is left at the roundabout, and then look for the brown sign. So kind of an overview of what I'll talk about here is just a look ahead of the progression of sea level rise on the county preserves. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the natural systems and how these changes that are coming are going to affect those and already have affected those. We're going to look at some of the current impacts that we can already see. Those of us who spend our time tromping around in the swamps already near the water can already see some pretty significant impacts that some of the people a little further upland might not be looking at yet. And then as more of a case study, Robinson Preserve, kind of our hallmark preserve as far as visitation and use. We get about 400,000 people a year that come through there and use the trails. It was recently expanded another 150 acres. And with the expansion, we had some of this sea level rise stuff in mind. That was the first one where we incorporated that into the design. And then look, based on that, kind of the future applications that are related there. So this is western Manatee County. Pretty much everything that doesn't have a house on it that you can see in this aerial photograph is areas that are under preservation. We were really lucky in Manatee County because a lot of our coastal areas stayed in agriculture while everybody moved to St. Pete and Sarasota. So the county was able, through some good leadership, was able to acquire a good bit of the coastal areas while they were in agricultural use and keep those from becoming high density developed areas. From a restoration standpoint, they're very difficult because they were former agriculture, so every nasty plant that grows in the state grows really well there. But on that same token, you're not having to design around a lot of things, so you don't have intact pine flatwoods habitats, so you can get creative with what you're going to do with the restoration there and create some new waterways and try to create some additional stormwater treatment and those kind of things. So the next couple of slides is just the NOAA bathtub model of what happens when these sea level rises come up. So this one here is just the current mean high water level. And now I'm just going to put it over there. There's 2 feet, 3 feet, and you can see, like everywhere else, Manatee County is also flat and it goes underwater. So to those people that don't really look at these bathtub models and make much sense, we had Tropical Storm Colin just came by in 2016 and put us up on, this is the tidal data from the station in St. Petersburg. So we had 1.87 feet higher than our normal water levels. So this is Robinson Preserve, one of our coastal trails, about 3 or 4 months ago on a normal day. And this is what it looks like when you put almost 2 feet of sea level rise on top of it. So you can see, as far as a recreational amenity that 400,000 people are using every year, we better start kayaking out here. But on the same token, it's also not full of very expensive infrastructure and houses and everything else. So the infrastructure that I'm talking about are things like this little rope line that goes along the edge. When we put the sea level rise on it, the rope line is fine. It's still there. Same thing here. This is out near our observation tower. We have, instead of a lift station and a parking garage, we went the bike rack out here. It's wooden, and we did use, because we knew it would be a possibility, we did use stainless steel nails on that. So, oh, I gotta go back. See, it did go under, but I checked it yesterday. It's still there. It's looking good. So this is basically that same, this is Robinson Preserve. This is with about 2 feet of rise on it. So you can see most of those areas went underwater there. So this is something that really, I try to always bring up, and I'm asked to talk about the future and how we're dealing with these things with sea level rise in Manatee County, is remind everybody that it's not just about what's going to happen in the future, that we're already seeing it. So this is not projections or anything else. This is what the tidal gauge in St. Petersburg has been reading since 1946. It's gone up about 8 inches on average, and that's observation, that's not projection. So that's numbers, but for those of us that are out tromping around in the swamps, there's evidence that we're seeing out there already. And to those of you that are not biologists, it's like, wow, nice picture of a stump. The stump's actually a pretty impressive one, because if you look under the stump, you'll see those are black mangrove pneumatophores that are sticking up underneath it. And if anybody's ever tried to grow a pine tree in a mangrove swamp, you got really frustrated, I'm sure. So the stump is from a pine tree. You can cut that off and smell it, and there's no doubt about it because it smells just like Christmas. So that's evidence that, okay, the pine tree grew out there when that sea level rise wasn't coming up and lapping at its roots, and that sea levels come up over those stumps can be really old, grant you that. That could be 200 or 300 years old. So that's one that, like, when I'm going out and giving tours, that kind of like, okay, there's direct evidence that I can see, that makes sense. The other one is this picture on the right. This is kind of a high marsh habitat that we have, and there's a lot of the trees that are starting to die. So the oak trees and stuff that were on that kind of transitional edge are now starting to succumb to the effects of the salt water on their roots. This one's a little scarier. We all know and love the mangroves for all of the great ecosystem services they provide. Started seeing on some of the aerial photographs some larger areas of die-off. And when you go out to them, that's what it looks like. So all of that carbon sequestration and habitat value that those mangroves are providing, we're not getting that same kind of value when they're dead. So this is kind of an example of that from Terracea Bay there. You can see this is the 2002 aerial. You can see, I'm scared I'm going to kill it. So on the 2002 aerial, this is where you can see that die-off was starting to be observable. So we go to 2008, 14. So we're seeing, I mean, this is way off from space. So we're having this start to occur in a couple of different areas. There's some different thoughts on why it is, whether it's fresh water getting stuck in there, or if it's that sea level rise is coming up faster than the pneumatophores on the black mangroves can grow, so they can't get oxygen and it's causing those trees to die. But we're not doing enough about it, in my personal opinion, but we're looking at it. That's the thing we're doing now. This is another example. This is up the Manatee River a little bit, where we get more of a oligohaline system. This is a 1940s aerial image where you can see what I've labeled on here is you've got your salt-bearing habitats, vast black needle rush marshes, and then these little upland river strands. So we switch that over to today. Everything's got this nice big green outline on it. That's where mangroves have started to move in. We're not getting those cold temperatures that would control those things. The salt-bearing, those kind of open habitats are completely gone. And the river strand habitats, you can tell where they were by the dead pine stumps that stick up out there now. So we're already seeing changes in the natural environment. This is one at the original portion of Robinson Preserve, where in 2007 you had an extensive amount of salt-bearing habitat, and then in 2019, and focus in where that blue arrow is, that's one of the oak trees that had succumbed to it. So the salt-bearing is really maintained by that kind of perfect elevation where that salt, the salt water is evaporated out and you get high salinities. But if those tides keep coming up, that condition doesn't exist anymore, and then the mangroves move into it. So our balance of natural habitats is being affected pretty significantly. So this is Robinson Preserve expansion. This is 150 acres that was adjacent to the 432 acres at Robinson that was added to it. And when we, this thing had been under agricultural production for years and years. It was mostly upland habitats out there. So we had an opportunity to say, well, what can we do, knowing that our trails, this great community amenity at Robinson Preserve, is going to be going underwater more and more. So we basically went from this kind of open pasture area, this was after a lot of the exotics removal was done with the photo on the left, to this thing on the right, where we've created a lot of waterways and really elevated those uplands to provide some coastal habitat, some coastal upland areas well into the future, so that you might have a bald eagle's nest that can live on a pine tree if you elevate the upland that you're going to grow it on by 20 feet is what we did. So that basically went from the design plan on the left is the approved high-end luxury golf course neighborhood that this thing almost was until the recession came. The one on the right that looks like one of those organ diagrams from a high school textbook this is all the different kinds of habitats that we were incorporating into this design. One thing that was really important to us with that was that we really take advantage of the existing adjacent habitats. We didn't want to kill ourselves trying to create a good upland habitat because the reality in this coastal setting is that it's isolated and it's going to be relatively small. So even if we did the world's best upland restoration project on 30 acres of upland, the panthers aren't coming back. There will be no black bears. So we decided to focus on the estuarine components, rebuild those parts that had been damaged to support a lot of the fisheries, create a lot of oyster habitat because that's something that we learned on our first phase that worked really well in here, and focus on salt marsh and mangrove habitats, all those habitats that sequester carbon really well. That's that blue carbon, that good carbon. So there's always engineers in the room, and I said that we went uphill, so I wanted to show the number of lines on there just because we were really proud of that because we got a lot of elevation, and we don't really get to do that very much here in Florida. So we were, I guess, still a mound building culture. This really boring slide of a bunch of numbers is just one of the things we did is kind of taking into consideration that we were going to be having increasing elevations. We didn't want to plant for a pine flatwoods habitat on something that in 20 years was going to be succumbing to that as well, because we knew it would take 30 or 40 years for that pine habitat to be respectably called a pine flatwoods habitat if we did a good restoration job. So we went out and surveyed the elevations where we could find where the salt water was already limiting the success of these plants, and then added 3 feet. So in our design, we're not going to start pine flatwoods until we add 3 feet of sea level rise on top of it so that it might grow up and be a pine flatwoods. This is just some pictures of the area that has all those lines on it. So I mean, this is not restoration in the purest restoration sense. There weren't giant mounds out here before. We created them. We're just trying to create some semblance of native habitat that's much better than what was there before. So by elevated, I mean we went from elevations around 2 and 3 that were just barely on the cusp of being an upland, and where we did the upland areas, we went up to 25 feet in some areas like this. Those areas also have the trails and that infrastructure on top of them as well. So if somebody wants to come out in the middle of a big storm surge, they can still keep their feet dry out here at Robinson Preserve. So one of the things too is like thinking about this is, so all this is going underwater. Why does this matter? I mentioned before, this is like creating these estuarine habitats. This is one of the best carbon sinks that we can possibly create. This becomes really important when we start using that scary retreat word, because what do you do with that area that you had to retreat from? If you can create, like we've got at Robinson Preserve, it's a community amenity. It's one of those things that's adding that property value. It's not just something you put the fence behind and say that's the flood area. Nobody likes the sound of that. So we focused in on that. One of the other things is the coastal upland habitats are becoming more and more rare, especially in our area, because the nice high coastal areas, we developed those right away. So there's a lot of these like coastal berm habitats in particular that have a real specific plant community they're going to go away. So if they're going to have a place where they can exist, where they need that coastal environment with those high calcareous soils, we can incorporate those into designs and keep that habitat in place for future generations to see. And then I mentioned before the economic impact when this thing does flood. It's the bike rack, and honestly, the bike rack, I'd move it for free. I wouldn't even charge. So we could bring that one up slope a little bit. And then the other one too is like just the temporal benefit of if you do this and you go and you spend a couple $100,000 on an observation tower that's going to get wet and not go one day. If you get 20 years of use out of that, that's that many people that are coming out there and coming and running on the trails and becoming stakeholders and becoming more aware of these situations too. So there's a lot of value even if it's just temporary. These are just some photos of it. The photo up, with the ruler on the bottom, that's that nice mangrove muck that's just full of that carbon that's just sitting in there. We got to do more of that. The kind of before and after, that's across Perico Bayou from Robinson Preserve. This is one of our coastal upland restoration areas where we put a lot of effort into it, but we were really successful at restoring a lot of effort. Let me double say that. But we got a good diversity. It doesn't come close to matching what Mother Nature can do, but it's good enough to bring the birds back and the birders back and get the county leadership on board with it being a good idea. And then it's something people can come out and enjoy. And we've been able to do some relocation of listed species on these properties. And this is kind of probably the main one to look at is this is the Palmetto Point area, northern Manatee County along the shore of Tampa Bay. So this is that same, I think this was like 6 feet of inundation. This is a pretty low area, but the Bay Colony area here, this is all homes. So this is gonna hurt really bad when this happens. So here, this is still agricultural production. We have a decision to make here. If we do Robinson Preserve, we move the bike racks up slope and we're okay. If we go through and we develop all this, we're putting that problem on our kids or somebody else, but I think there's smarter ways to do this, and there's a lot of opportunities like this out there. So I guess in closing, for my part of it, I think make more preserves. It allows these mitigation or migration of habitats. There's a lot of good projects that are out there that you can learn from with this thing. I think it's going to become really important when we have to look at the retreat scenario in some of these areas. And I think even we could do a better job too if we specifically look to gear these projects toward carbon sequestration and water quality benefits instead of just starting to draw lines on a map and think, hey, that looks cool, that'll grow a snook, I like catching those. And then one thing is do more, just get out and document what's out there a little bit more. That's one of my passions there. This is just kind of a quick overview of, this is that same Robinson Preserve property. I've been making it a point anywhere that these areas that are really low-lying areas, I go out and document every single kind of plant that grows out there so that we can use those as a basis for future restoration plans. And that's all I got.